Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Mary and Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maya Ghosh, and I am one of your Ath Fellows for the year. Given the news cycles of the past few years, it should be no surprise to you that citizens of democracies who claim to value tenets such as freedom, tolerance, and the rule of law have increasingly embraced illiberal practices and politicians. On January 6th, the nation watched with bated breath during the siege on the U.S. Capitol building. Voting laws across the country have become more restrictive and political discourse less civil. Democracy is in trouble, but who is to blame? Tonight, Tom Nichols, professor of national security affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, challenges the current depictions of the rise of illiberal and anti-democratic movements in the United States and elsewhere as a result of the deprivations of globalization or the malign decisions of elites. Rather, he places the blame for the rise of illiberalism on the people themselves and makes a strong argument for civic re-engagement. Professor Nichols is a U.S. Naval War College professor and an adjunct at the U.S. Air Force School of Strategic Force Studies and the Harvard Extension School. He is a specialist on international security affairs, including U.S. Russia relations, nuclear strategy, and NATO issues. He is a columnist for USA Today and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. He is the author of The Death of Experience, No Use, Nuclear Weapons and National Security, and Eve of Destruction, The Coming Age of Preventative War. His newest book is Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. And most impressively, he is a 5-time undefeated Jeopardy champion. Now, a few reminders before we get started. Please be sure to keep your mask over your nose and mouth for the duration of the program indoors. If you'd like to take a drink of water, please step outside of the dining room to do so. Also, please remember no audio or visual recordings. And lastly, take a deep breath. Remember to be present in the space. And if you have any questions, write them down because there'll be some time for Q&A at the end. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Nichols to the AF.
Thank you very much, and thank you all so much for having me here and inviting me, and for having me in person, because I know that's been a challenge, but it's been really wonderful to be. I've been to California many times, but I've never been to Claremont, so this is really exciting for me. And it's been great to reconnect with old colleagues, but to make some new friends as well. So thanks again for bringing me here. I wish it were a happier occasion and that I were talking about something more cheerful, but unfortunately, I think we have to talk about the problem before us, and that is the decline of democracy here in the United States and around the world. Democracy is in trouble. There's just simply no way to sugarcoat it. There's no way to say it in anything but starkest terms. And not just in the United States. Illiberal movements, that is to say, movements that reject the foundations of small L liberal democracy, like tolerance and cooperation and equality and the rule of law, are under siege, even in places like the United Kingdom, the home to the mother of parliaments, Poland, Italy, Brazil, Turkey, India, Hungary. Citizens in, I shouldn't say all citizens, but a significant number of citizens in these countries are rejecting the foundations of liberal democracy. And I want to be clear when we're talking about this tonight. I will try not to just lecture at you here and so that we can get to a discussion, because I think that'll be the most interesting thing we can do. When I talk about citizens rejecting liberal democracy, I don't mean citizens who are upset about bad policy. I don't mean citizens who want to overturn their existing political leadership and find better political leaders or better policies. I'm talking about people who have made a fundamental decision that constitutionalism, liberalism, the fundamental order of rule of law is simply not for them. It doesn't deliver what they want, and they've had enough of it, and they would just as soon discard it. There is a big difference between saying, I am upset about my government's policies and I want a different government, and saying, I am upset about my government's policies and therefore I want no government at all. or a government that answers only to me and oppresses someone else. This has been, I think, stirred and motivated by populism on both the right and the left. I am an old school, I suppose, small c conservative. I've more than once been accused of being an elitist, but I have no use for populism. I think it's a terrible form of, a terrible way to govern and a terrible way to try to produce better government. And I think the founders are pretty much on my side in that. So as George Will once said, if you disagree with me, your argument is with James Madison and not with me. We don't usually define this populism, and I think some commentators around the world have been kind of cowed by it because it's always phrased in the name of the people. And of course, who could be against the people? But we never define this. It's always the people, and you can tell that it's been capitalized. And usually what it means is the people who aren't in my political movement. The people who are with me are the people. Everyone else are the elites or the enemy or the problem. The other day, someone pointed out to me that a Senate candidate in Ohio decided that professors are the enemy. I don't think of myself as an elite. I just will give you a little background on myself before I proceed with this. I was born in a factory town in western Massachusetts. My parents grew up during the Depression. My mother had a 9th grade education. My dad had a 10th grade education. By the time I was heading into high school, there was a kind of a 50-50 shot that I was going to go to college or maybe to jail, because sometimes that's how people grow up. Some of my friends from high school became guests of the state for a short time. I think we have now stretched the term elite to mean anyone who is not on my side. And the people are the people on my side. And I think this is part of our division. This is part of how we have become our own worst enemy, that we have created artificial delineations like this and marked them out as opposing camps. Well, why is this happening? There have been a lot of theories about this, and I think most of them weren't very good. This kind of gets to the larger question of why would I write this book? I found that the last few books I've written, people say, why would you write this? What made you want to live with this? Like the last book I wrote called The Death of Expertise, about why people don't listen to experts. Why did you write this? Well, because I was mad. Because people weren't listening to me. And the book I wrote before that was about nuclear war and nuclear strategy. And that was, I marketed that one as a holiday feel-good read for the whole family. But I wrote this in part because I was frustrated with the explanations for this illiberal rise of these illiberal movements in the United States and around the world. We could see them happening. I actually held off on writing about this, and I will say that during the pandemic, I was actually blocked on writing this for a while. You would think a pandemic, right? You can't go anywhere. You're a writer, sit in your room and write. It turns out that's not a good way to write. But also because I couldn't believe what I was trying to wrestle with. I kept asking, looking into the literature and trying to think this through. And I didn't want to write a book about Donald Trump, and I didn't want to write a book about, Boris Johnson or Erdogan or, someone like, I wanted to think about why this was happening in a larger sense. But I became frustrated, and I decided to pursue this book because I thought that the explanations we were getting just weren't very good, because they were always kind of throwaway explanations like, well, it's globalization. My friend Ian Bremmer wrote a book. He said, well, it's globalization. It's made people insecure. They feel forgotten. They feel undermined. They're unhappy. And Ian and I actually debated this a few times in public. And I think, as a good debate is, we've made each other think. But I thought that answer was wrong. I think the political parties kept providing answers. Why is there an anti-democracy movement in the United States? Well, people on the right were saying, well, again, we're forgotten, and the elites hate us, and no one cares about the Ohio Valley, or no one cares about opioids. And the answer from the left is because people are racist, and because they're fundamentally bad, and because they have become that some kind of horror in them has been unleashed. And there are elements of truth in all of this. There are no doubt real causes going on that have to do with things like the change in the global economy, with the change in demography in America. But part of maybe one of the things that was different about this for me is that I came at this not as an Americanist, because I don't have that kind of training. I came at this as a comparativist, which is where I did have my training, and as an international relations specialist, because I said that these explanations are very American. You know, I'm sorry, but the Ohio Valley is 4 states. It doesn't explain France. It doesn't explain Turkey. It doesn't explain India. And we're going to have to do better than, well, there's an opioid epidemic and nobody cared about it. Well, that does not explain Boris Johnson. I'm sorry. The other thing that struck me is that these simple explanations, or these first cut explanations about poverty and globalization and forgotten towns, didn't correspond very well with the data. The fact of the matter is that the movements against democracy in these countries are not being led by the poorest. Very often people said to me when I was working on this book, and I would talk with friends and colleagues and sometimes with opponents and interlocutors, they'd say, well, this is because of poverty, and it's because of income inequality, and it's because of climate change or other miseries. And I said, yes, but the poorest people in these nations are not the ones that are leading this charge. Here in the United States, the anti-democracy movement, if pure poverty were to explain all this, if being forgotten and being poor explained all this, then the core of the anti-democracy movement in the United States would be African Americans. And it's not. And the more you looked at it, and again, I think it really helped to do this in a comparative context, when you started to look at places like Italy, when you started to look at the more illiberal aspects of the Brexit movement in the UK, when you started to look at India, what you started to find was the new enemies of democracy are resolutely middle class. And that was a striking finding. And I think that led me to say, we have to look inward. And I struggled. I have wonderful editors at Oxford. I've had my second book with Oxford, and I worked with this great team, and we had a lot of jokey titles that I won't share with you. But we had to get out of this. How do we, look at ourselves? And we finally came up with Our Own Worst Enemy after a lot of, I would say, more incendiary titles that were rejected because they're not suitable for a family bookstore. But I was pretty angry about this. I mean, I said, we have to stop kind of making these easy excuses. We have to finally hold up a mirror here. I identified what I thought were 3 large trends over the course of 30 to 40 years. And I basically said, we are the victims of our own success. This is happening because of peace, prosperity, affluence, and technology and very high living standards. Now, immediately, people, I think, bristle at some of these explanations. Peace, bah. We haven't been at peace. We haven't been at peace in years. America's, we live in the age of forever wars. One of the few phrases, and I really hate that phrase, that liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats all use. Joe Biden used it. Donald Trump used it. And yet, as I pointed out, for the average American, these conflicts are invisible. I wrote a piece. By the way, I'm soon to leave the Naval War College. I'm going to go on with the rest of my career, but I am supposed to tell you I don't represent the views of the government, as if that was a mystery up until a moment ago. But I wrote a piece for The Atlantic where I pointed out, why is everyone mad about Afghanistan and the pullout from Afghanistan? Because for 20 years we didn't care about it, and then we wanted it to go perfectly. We wanted the option where we could just pull out and everything was okay, because we outsourced all of this to volunteers for 20 years, and we said, go do good stuff and don't let anything bad happen and don't put it on the news and don't talk to us about it. In the piece, I quoted a foreign policy analyst who had a great line about this, and I wish I'd written it, but it's so great that I stole it. He said, to find the impact of Afghanistan on any congressional election in the United States over 20 years, you would need an electron microscope. Fact is, nobody cared. That's peace. In the book, I talk about how when I was a boy, I grew up in an Air Force town And I think of myself not as a boomer. I was born in 1960, but I also started high school the first year that there were absolutely no combat troops in Vietnam. I started high school in 1975. For me, Vietnam, which I had grown up with every day, every minute of every day, by 1975 was completely gone. But until 1975, really until about 1973, 74, it was every day. I was acutely aware of the existence of Vietnam. I now live, and I lived in an Air Force town, so B-52s were taking off over my house. I now live in a Navy town. My daughter lived, and she and her friends, my daughter's 18, a freshman in college, and her awareness of Afghanistan and Iraq was almost zero. Never saw it on the news, didn't see people walking around town in uniforms, weren't being deployed, no one was being drafted. And I think this mattered. Now, I'll talk about the Cold War more in a moment, because I think the end of the Cold War was a particular effect here that removed the notion that a large competing enemy power that intended us harm every day was simply gone. After 1991, we were able to live with, I would argue, a degree of unseriousness about the world. We no longer had to worry, for example, I mean, when I was a kid, up until until I was 30-odd years old, we would elect a president and say, is this the person you'd want to have the codes to the nuclear arsenal? Is this the person you'd want dealing with a crisis? After 91, 92, we said, who cares? What crisis? Russians are our friends. Nuclear weapons, nobody even thinks about them. Part of the reason I wrote a book about nuclear weapons was that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs one day said, no one studies it. I don't have any nuclear experts in the government. We don't do nuclear strategy. Nobody cares. And I said, somebody ought to care. I think as well, the disappearance of an alternative to our way of life. I mean, we won. We won. It was over. You know, there was no alternative model out there. After 9/11, we tried to make that into a kind of new. I wrote a book about that, saying I think this is like a new Cold War. Our enemies are ideological enemies, and even I fell for that after a while. But there really wasn't an existential challenge that governed our lives anymore. So that's the first part, is that we were able to kind of write off foreign policy, we could outsource all of our security problems to volunteers and not think about it. Prosperity, again, people blanch when I say this, but the housing crisis and the Great Recession and I was talking earlier with some of the students I know are here, that part of the reason I wrote this book was years of my undergraduates saying to me, Professor, I teach undergraduates at night, I teach military guys in the day, and my undergraduates say, but Professor, these are the worst times ever. You know, these are the worst, and I would kind of reel and say, these aren't even the worst times in my adult life. I mean, until you've, and I would say things like, how many of, well, I'll even ask it here, how many people have ever heard the term stagflation? See, Claremont, you policy guys. Well done, Jack and Zach, and yeah, good. That's the first time that I've ever seen a majority. I would ask my students, how many, it's stagflation? And they'd say, oh, I've heard of inflation. I said, no, I didn't say that. And I said, what has happened that we have gotten to the point where no matter what happens in the economy, good or bad, we think it's bad? This just came up last week in a news story where President Biden had a pretty good, by any president's standards, last week was a pretty good week. You know, unemployment numbers, the jobs numbers, the stock market, you know, the infrastructure deal, and Americans like 70-30 think the country's completely going to hell and the economy's a total hot mess. But, which is, I'm sorry, but empirically completely indefensible, but that's how as I point out in the book, you can always flip those numbers by changing the party in charge. Go to a Republican convention when Obama was president. Say, how do you think the economy's doing? Oh, gruesome. Go to a Democratic convention, you know, when Trump was president. You can't live like this. It's crazy. And then, you know, a month later, when the party switched parties, you know, things are getting better. We do this all the time. But the fact is, For 30 years, we have been a relatively prosperous country. Even the Great Recession, we can argue about this later during the Q&A. I would argue the Great Recession was, how did we, create a Great Recession? We took out mortgages for houses we couldn't afford, and took out a lot of them. And then we let guys on Wall Street monetize them and turn it into a big casino because everybody thought they were going to make money out of it. That's different than, say, the Great Depression, or even the recession of the 1970s. I mean, I always feel like I'm doing my Grandpa Simpson, shaking my fist at you kids. But I graduated from college into 10% unemployment. If you guys had to live with 10% unemployment, absent a pandemic, you'd freak out because that is bad. Trust me, it's bad. And we, had to live with things like oil shocks and other things that were exogenous to the economy that were really, when car loans were 18%, that happened. And yet, every year we say, this is the worst, we've never lived through this. And I think it's because we've gotten used to it. We've gotten used to these high levels of prosperity that are almost like a ratchet effect. And also, I couldn't help this. I was talking with my table mates. I teach a course on pop culture during the Cold War. And one of the things I put into this book was, if you follow the kind of ebbs and flows of pop music, it has been the worst economy ever every 10 years since 1975. Bruce Springsteen writes about his town dying in 1976. And then he writes about his town dying again in 1984. And then he wrote about his town dying again in 2012. And then he wrote a song about how the bosses should be taken to task for killing his town again a few years after that. And you say, Bruce, where the hell do you live, man? That, every 10 years somebody nukes your town. But that is part of the problem that we have become marinated in nostalgia. Even you, younger people who didn't live through it, you are nostalgic now for a time that you didn't experience. And this is happening around the world. We have studies about this where younger people are saying, I am nostalgic for the 1970s, when everything was cheap and everything was good and jobs were plentiful and the skies were blue and the water was clear and love was new and, blah, 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 blah. It has gotten out of control. I mean, that we now have a group of political entrepreneurs who keep fueling this in a way that previous generations did not. And it is literally getting out of control that people believe that democracy has failed because they are convinced that 1970 was better, 1980 was better, 1990 was better. Anything other than the past 5 years was better than what we're living through now. But the fact of the matter is, we have lived through a very prosperous time. That doesn't mean income inequality doesn't exist. It doesn't mean healthcare isn't expensive. It doesn't mean education is chokingly expensive. I mean, yes, education is expensive. When I began college in 1979, it was much cheaper. Of course, only 14% of women went to college, so there's that. We don't think about we cherry pick these moments to say, look at what tuition was in 1979. I'm like, yes, that was a problem that middle and upper class males had to worry about because you weren't going to college. There would not have been nearly this many women in the room 40 years ago. That's just a reality. A worker could afford, one worker could afford an apartment in New York for a family of 4. Yes, he could, because his wife was not allowed to work or have a credit card or get a car loan or get a divorce. Before we get too nostalgic about these things, we ought to think about what we're actually asking for. Finally, I want to talk a bit about technology and living standards. There is a thing called hedonic adaptation that I think has been governing all of this, which is hedonic adaptation is when you get used to the level that you're living at and you think any step backward is horrible. It's like if you've been sleeping in a queen-size bed and you go home to visit your parents and your twin bed is there, you think it's the most uncomfortable bed you've ever been in because you've been sleeping in a big bed. If you've been eating steak, if you've been eating sirloin, pot roast tastes like leather, and so on. I think we have just, again, ratcheted to the point where we say, anything that is less than the standard of living I have come to expect is not just bad, it's a failure of democracy. It's a failure of our system of government. Not a failure of policy, but a failure of this whole misbegotten idea called representative democracy. This would be incomplete without a word about the technological miracle of hyperconnectedness. I love the internet. Any of you who follow me on Twitter know I love it maybe too much. On the other hand, we have become lonelier and more connected to each other at the same time because we only connect to each other through the mediating presence of a screen. We don't really talk to each other. We sink our fangs into each other to drain each other of psychic energy long distance through social media. And this is a serious problem. We are too connected to each other. We are too connected to all forms of media. I tell people when we argue about how to get your news and how to stay informed, and I'm constantly banging this drum about how people are simply too uninformed to be reasonable citizens, I tell people, look, I'm paid to have opinions. I'm actually paid to think stuff and write them down and have opinions, and I don't watch 4 hours a night of cable news. And yet you do. And by the time you're done with it, especially if you're watching Fox, which is designed to do this, but whether it's Facebook, sometimes MSNBC, CNN, tabloidizing a lot of these stories, by the time it gets to 11 o'clock, you're all in a rage. You're in a lather. Again, thinking this is the worst thing that's ever happened. Worst times ever. We're in constant danger. The economy's in free fall. Everybody's a criminal. I'm surrounded by fascists. As David Frum had a great line about this. He said, take a walk. Order the salmon. Don't eat junk food. Get up, exercise a little, go outside and get some fresh air. But we won't do that. Add to this the problem that I think all of these have produced a collapse of civic virtue. Now, civic virtue in a democracy is always difficult because it's an act of will. It takes thinking about it. And most of us don't want to get up every morning and say, am I a good citizen? We want to believe we are, and then we want to do other things. We don't want to have to think about that. But I think we have entered a period where we are so drowning in leisure. I mean, I hesitate to use the word decadent because my old enemies in the Soviet Union used to throw that at me when I was a young scholar of Soviet affairs, but I think there is an element of decadence involved in this, where we have just gravitated toward what's interesting to us rather than what is good for our communities. There's a guy I quote in the book, a voter in California that, here in Los Angeles, in fact, interviewed by the New York Times. And he was asked who he was voting for in 2016, and he said, I don't really like Donald Trump's policies, and I tend more toward what Hillary Clinton is. He said, but I have to admit, I just want to see what's going to happen. It's boring to watch people get along. I want to see people fight. That is utterly, the guy they interviewed, he's mid-40s, seemed like a, otherwise nice enough fellow, but that is an utterly uncivic approach. That says, entertain me. This is about making life interesting. This was pioneered by Berlusconi in Italy, the bunga bunga prime minister who was, a clown who kept everybody entertained while he was raiding the state's coffers until he was finally driven out. I think in the United States, Trump is the worst and most obvious example of this. He is an ongoing reality show, and he says so. You'll miss me. Your ratings will plummet when I'm not president. But there are other. Boris Johnson. I mean, I'm sorry, but this is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. What's worse about this, as Anne Applebaum pointed out in a recent book on the rise of authoritarianism, Johnson was a big booster of Brexit and waving flags and parachuting in. But she said she was personally present behind the scenes. Johnson laughed at Brexiteers. He thought they were idiots. He didn't care about Brexit. And I think this cynicism has become just startling. I mean, I think here in the United States in particular, and it pains me to say this as a former Republican, but that the Republicans have really pioneered, the art of being Ivy League graduates worth millions of dollars with degrees from the best universities in America, talking about how professors and pointy heads and people with education are the enemy. That is utterly cynical. And I think it is something that you will find when you travel around the world. And the other thing that's really striking about these populist movements is they're all bankrolled by extremely wealthy people. This notion that these are all grassroots, the five-star movement in Italy that cropped up 5-6 years ago, well, maybe even longer, 6-7 years ago, which was led by a comedian, by a professional comedian, whose first major splash into public life was in Bologna when he encouraged everyone to sign a petition for Vaffanculo Day, which in Italian means F off day, FU day. And they became part of the governing coalition, bankrolled by incredibly wealthy people in Italy. Once again, these are folks that are speaking to a bored middle class. These are not people that are, going to the forgotten towns and the poorest people and the suffering and the people that don't have clean water. These are people saying to middle-aged, middle-class people, those eggheads and all the other people in the world, they don't respect you enough. So let's get back at them. Let's just screw up the government and toss all of this constitutional nonsense because it'll be a blast. And unfortunately, that has seeped into everyone, not just these populist movements. Let me give you a couple examples from the book about how bad this has gotten. I literally in a few cases, I had to backtrack the research because I couldn't believe what I was reading. The woman a caucus goer in Iowa. Now, caucus goers are the most politically involved people, right? They are not just primary voters. These are people like making an effort to go to a caucus, to, negotiate with other people. They said, who's your, Democratic caucus? They said, who's your guy? And she said, well, I really like Pete Buttigieg. Healthcare, this is what I want for me. And they said, okay, and what's your following? She said, well, and this is in the book. She said, if I can't get Buttigieg, I guess I'll just vote for Trump. You cannot make sense out of a voter. That's a voter who says, I just want things to be interesting. And if I don't get my guy, I'll just change the channel and I'll put on a different show. A political reporter in Pennsylvania talking to two brothers, who were arguing about politics, two brothers in Scranton, Joe Biden's hometown. He said, one of them says, look, I don't like Donald Trump, but the Democratic Party has just drifted too far to the left for me. I just can't vote for Joe Biden. He is just too much of a leftist. He's gone too far to the left. Now, Bernie Sanders or Pete Buttigieg, I could have voted for. How do you talk to a voter like this? And again, I think you can't. I think this is and Eric Hoffer warned about this in a very important book, if you've never read it, called The True Believer in 1951. And Francis Fukuyama warned about it again in 1992, that a bored middle class can be one of the most dangerous enemies of democracy there is. Because an angry, impoverished class will want, they'll want a different government, they'll want a different kind of leadership, they'll want different policies. A bored middle class is dangerous to democratic principles themselves, a lumpen bourgeoisie that simply cares about itself and nothing else. And I think that's what we're seeing develop around the world. And I think the way you get that is through affluence, peace, a kind of fundamental unseriousness about politics that allows the voters to retreat into themselves and say, I just want life to be interesting and I want what's good for me. That leads me to the underlying driver of all of this. And I actually brought this up in The Death of Expertise, and I returned to it in this book, which is the real pandemic we've all been facing for 40 years, which is narcissism. This is not an impression on my part. Social psychologists have been tracking this. I don't want to say, with no prejudice to our current audience, by tracking college students, by the way. One of the big longitudinal studies is asking college students about narcissism, but of course they've been tracking it since I was in college, so clearly I'm part of the problem as well. But there is no doubt that all of the indicators of narcissism, that entitlement and resentment and the inability to see other people as real people, that's been growing, and it's been growing since the early 70s. Some of us of a certain age in here will remember, people say, oh, how can this be? This is new. Well, the 1970s were famously labeled the me decade. And I would simply argue that the 70s never ended in that sense and simply got worse. I think part of that narcissism, that withdrawing inward, at least here in the United States in particular, to some extent in Europe, is driven by demographic anxiety. I think some of this is, and particularly in the United States, it is just white anxiety about becoming a minority and losing power. A colleague of mine at the Atlantic, Yoni Applebaum, has pointed out that this has never happened in the modern era, where demographically the most powerful group in society has simply been kind of overwhelmed over time without a major war or other traumatic event, just by natural processes to become the dispossessed minority within its own country. But I would argue that, and in some ways, despite my old school conservatism, this book is something of a critique of capitalism as well. We've marketized everything. We've monetized and marketized everything, including social conflict. And that, in part, comes from monetizing the news, where the news is no longer news. It is tribally affiliated streams of information that are put out so that you can stovepipe yourself, feel better about the things you believe, and never encounter an idea that you disagree with. And I think that's remarkably dangerous, because now we're all living in alternative realities where we believe things that aren't true. And I know it's fashionable to really dump on the right about this, and we should, because I think that's where most of this is a problem. But don't kid yourselves. When I talk to people from the left who assure me, argue with me, that there is no way that Donald Trump won 2016 because the Russians reached in and physically hacked and changed the vote in the United States. Now, this did not happen. I'm sorry, it just didn't happen. And yet I know people who live in that reality, that the Russians control our voting machines. This is, add to this all of the other things that people believe, microchips and vaccines and Venezuelan voting machines and, JFK. I mean, if it doesn't scare you how many people showed up in Dallas to see if John F. Kennedy was going to, JFK Jr. was going to rise from the grave, I mean, that's a sign of a sick society. I know it's not all of us, not all Americans, but a society that can produce that many people as a kind of flash mob to show up for something that crazy is a problem. Political entrepreneurs seize on this negativity. You're right. Everything's terrible. These are the worst times ever. Only I can fix it. Nobody runs for office by saying, you know what, the other guy's a pretty good guy too, but I could do better. We used to run for office that way. John McCain, imagine what happened in our politics, that John McCain said, no ma'am, Barack Obama, you are wrong about Barack Obama. He's a good man and a family man, and I just have deep disagreements with him. And people went after John McCain saying he was weak. A guy that had been tortured for years by the North Vietnamese was weak because he wouldn't attack Barack Obama personally. The other thing that's happened with the internet, and this could be a whole separate thing in itself, and we could talk about for hours, but I also think that the internet has shortened the distance between disparate cultures in the United States and elsewhere. It used to be that people, and I stole this from a friend of mine named Nick Bosdev that I work with at War College. Nick pointed out, he said, it used to be that people in Ohio didn't care what people in New York thought. You didn't have people in Ohio saying, we have good sushi here too, They said, we don't eat that. We don't eat raw fish. Stupid people eat raw fish. We eat barbecue. Now, because the internet has created a competition among all of these cultures and kind of privileged the urban cultures as the best culture, people in Ohio say, well, we have to, if we don't have good sushi too, we're losers. Instead of simply saying, we have better barbecue than New York. That used to be different. It used to be that we did not, as a country, spend so much time asking each other what we think of each other. I am happy to say that I was a very provincial New Englander. The first time I came to Southern California, I came here in 1979. I was 18 years old, and I said, you people are, this is crazy. You people don't, you people need to comb your hair and straighten up, and because I'd grown up in Massachusetts, and California shocked me. It was a culture I'd never encountered before, especially California in the late 70s. I can't go into it, but ask your professors, they can tell you. And so this narcissistic culture has produced people saying, look, I'm never wrong, and I don't want to know about stuff that would make me wrong, and I don't want to hear from other people who disagree with me. And that, you cannot sustain a democracy on that. Well, how does all this end? Let me just depress everybody, and then we'll go to questions. I think we fall not to a mob, but to our own laziness and indolence. It doesn't end with the burning of the Capitol. It doesn't end with, a military junta. It ends with, in the end of the book, I suggest a few alternate scenarios. One of them I call 1984, but without the violence, where a very small number of privileged people live in beautiful skyscrapers, and the proles, if you've ever read 1984, the people that are beneath suspicion, they are not above suspicion, they are beneath suspicion, because they are so politically unaware that the regime needs not care about them at all. As Balzac once put them, people who do not need to be crushed because they already lie too flat beneath the foot. Where they will be given calories and intoxicants and luxuries and entertainments, and they will leave the governing authorities alone, and they will leave the wealthy alone. I think some of that's happening. That's the future, where we have beautiful gleaming spires and favelas in every direction out of there. The other is the one that I think is more likely, and I quoted a movie that, again, there will be a generational difference. My older colleagues will remember a movie called 3 Days of the Condor. But if you haven't seen it, I'll ruin the ending for you. It's about a failed rogue plot within the CIA to take over the Middle East. And when Robert Redford, the hero, discovers this, he's talking to this CIA guy who doesn't seem bothered that this happened at all. And he says, how can you be like this? What about the people? And he says, you know what the people are going to do? And Redford says, they'll want you to ask them. And he said, no, not now. Ask them when their cars won't start, or their houses are cold, or when people have never been hungry start feeling hunger. He said, and he says it with this utter cynicism, he says, you know what? They're not going to want us to ask them. They're just going to want us to get it for them. I think that's happening now. I think that we're sliding from democracy into technocracy by default. Because we're basically sending that message to our elected leaders. Look, just get it. Keep the Wi-Fi on. Make sure that there's enough sports channels. Make sure that gas is cheap enough. Not the proles, not living in abject poverty and just kind of kept indolent with casinos and living far from the cities, but middle-class people saying, democracy to me means a certain standard of living. And as long as you provide that, I don't really care about the other stuff. That worries me a lot, because that's voluntary. That's us simply saying, yeah, just take care of things. And if you think I'm being too cynical, imagine how your elected leaders have to think through the problem, and I've talked about this in the book, where I called the people that did the study because I didn't believe what I was reading. What do you do with a public that says, hi, I'm one of your constituents. Yeah, okay. Here's my demand. I want you to overturn Obamacare, but I want you to keep the Affordable Care Act. That's about 30% of the country. You know what your elected leaders say at that moment? They say, got it, will do. Then they hang up they say, thank you for your interest in policy. And they hang up the phone and say, whatever, let's just do the things, let's keep the lights on and stay in power and keep getting reelected and keep the planes flying, and it'll work out. That's on us. That's our problem. I ended with reminding us that ancient Greece and the ancient democracies can remind us of virtue. When you're feeling down, read the funeral oration of Pericles about the superiority of constitutional democracy and of open government and of engagement and citizenship. But remember, as I remind you at the end of the book, democracy did not survive in Athens, and Pericles didn't live to see it. He died 2 years into the war with Sparta from a plague. which seemed a little bit too on the nose for a book written in 2021. What can we do about it? I have some ideas at the end of the book, I won't go into them here, about projects that we could undertake together, including political projects, enlarging the size of the House, a very short period of military training, maybe a summer, to bring people back into having to cooperate with each other for at least a month or two, strengthening political parties, which I think is very important, but none of those will work unless there is a fundamental change in how we think about ourselves as citizens. And I'll just end with a story that I tell at the beginning of the book that I will try, because when I went to Stephanie's class today, the student said, what's the outcome of all this? And I said, like Charles Dickens, I said, doom. So let me try and end on a happier note. I want to get back to a place that we were at. My father died in 2012, and he died just before the election. And my father was, there's no nice way to say this, my father was a Republican, but my father was also a bigot. He was born in 1918. He was one of those, he was part of the white working class that was a FDR Democrat until '68, felt that the Democrats had shifted to the left, became a hardcore Republican, had no problem dropping racial epithets, sexist jokes, you name it. He was like a lot of people, and he was my father. So, he wasn't perfect, but that's how it was. Yet, he did not speak that way about Barack Obama. My father still felt that there were lines, that the President of the United States, he just didn't do that. And we were watching Obama give a speech just before my dad died. And I'm from Massachusetts, and we all liked Romney, and we said, Romney would be a perfectly fine president. I said, I don't know, Dad, I think, beating Barack Obama, I don't think that's going to happen. And after a lifetime of the kinds of things he had said, my father nodded, and he said, he's a good man. They're both good men. We'll be fine. We're going to be fine no matter who wins. They're both good. They're both good men. We can do that. We can look at politics that way again. If my father can do that, anybody can do that. That's how we used to think about politics. We don't do that anymore. We have now entered a period where we think everything is a complete cataclysm that is the end of the world, because of course that's a more interesting world to live in. How we get back to that, I'm not sure, but I think it starts with each of us being an example of the kind of voter and citizen that we want to be to other people, and by being engaged and by being informed. I'll stop there. We can certainly talk about more of that in the discussion, but I think there is some hope here. But I think we're in for a dark few years, no matter what happens next. I think that much I'm very concerned about. But we have the resilience, and our institutions have the resilience to survive this if we care enough about them to save them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nichols. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the evening. So if you have a question, we ask that you stand behind one of these two mics, and be sure to introduce yourself.
Hey, Professor Nichols, thank you so much for your talk.
Sure.
My name is Jay Morris. I am a junior at CMC. And my question it regards this quote I was thinking of over and over during your talk, and it is, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create hard times. Do you think this quote is accurate at all? And if so, since we're living in good times, will it require bad times for us to get to the point where we can, be collectively stronger, and how would that even work out?
It's a wonderful question, and I want to be clear that and I said this in the book, none of this is my argument for some kind of blood and iron solution to all of this. Truthfully, I have to own up to a bad prediction. When I wrote The Death of Expertise, people would ask me how we get out of that cul-de-sac about this stovepiping of knowledge, and I said, well, usually these things get sorted out with a return to expertise during a war or a depression or a pandemic. I did not foresee the idea that we could politicize a pandemic. So I don't think that bad times are the answer to this. I have always hoped that there's some kind of great reawakening, some kind of spiritual rebirth in America. I don't think that's impossible. I think anybody who lived through the 1970s could tell you that if you really thought America was over, it was very easy to think that around 1977, 1976, I mean, our bicentennial, and yet we were flat on our butts. The Soviet newspapers were saying, the correlation of forces has shifted, America is defeated in Vietnam, their economy is at a standstill. Gerald Ford was going to NATO to plead with them to stay together. Imagine this, that in the 70s, we had a president and a vice president that no one had elected in 1976. Think about that. Imagine what kind of conspiracy theories would be insanely ripping through this country right now if we had a president and a vice president who were both appointed and no one had actually elected them. And yet, somehow, we were able to find, and I'm not going to give all the credit to Ronald Reagan here, I think there was also generational change. I think there was, the Soviet Union helped us out by invading Afghanistan and reminding us they were dangerous. But Jimmy Carter gives that infamous speech in which he never says the word malaise, but basically says there is a spiritual emptiness in America. And I remember seeing that speech as a teenager and saying, yeah, there is. We don't care about anything anymore. We came out of that. I don't know if we can do it again. I think at some point, there's a great line in a James Bond novel, and we're talking about James Bond. I was talking with Zach earlier today about James Bond novels, where one of the characters in a Bond novel says that courage is a capital sum reduced by expenditure. Maybe civic virtue is a capital sum reduced by expenditure, and it doesn't replenish itself as fast as we think it does. But I think it can be done. But I don't think it's like, well, what we really need? We really need some hard times and misery. I think if World War III began tomorrow, and there were Russian paratroopers in Boston and Chinese paratroopers landing in Los Angeles, first thing we'd all do is blame each other for whose fault it was. And I'm sorry to say that. So maybe this is just going to take some time and some introspection. But I don't know. But it's a great question.
Thank you.
But just to be clear, that is not my advocated solution. Let's get out there and, what everybody here needs? A good solid war. That'll get us back on our feet. That is not my intention at all, and I think that would be a disaster.
My name's George Ashford. Thank you very much for your talk. One of your colleagues at The Atlantic, I believe it was David Brooks, recently wrote a piece about the populism on the right coming from a reaction to the cultural drift on the behalf of the left and the centralization of cultural power in urban cities that were increasingly diverging, moving much faster left than the rest of the country. And so do you see that as part of this? Does that factor into your theories, or is it in opposition to it?
I had some problems with that article because I thought David sort of overhyped that argument that, because it's exactly the kind of argument that a highly educated man who lives in New York City would say, oh, we've just become so progressive and interesting in New York that we've scared the rest of the country. I think David Shore, who's a progressive data analyst, put it much better. He said, the parties are now led by people, a majority of whom went to college. And so their policy positions seem, and he said both parties, their policy positions seem perfectly reasonable to them because the only people they ever talk to are other college graduates, and they don't realize that this all sounds, pretty unsettling to people in other parts of the country. But I have, again, being, coming from a working class background, having had parents like that, I think there's a limit to that explanation. Because I think that's a good explanation for why people don't like parties or don't like certain politicians. That is not an explanation for why people think they have to storm the Capitol because there's a Democratic Party pedophile conspiracy in charge of stealing the votes. That's where I draw the line. And I think, again, that attitude is people saying, yeah, I'm not respected, I'm kind of looked down on, I say this in the book, and I quoted S.E. Cupp, but I won't hang poor S.E. out to dry on this quote because I agreed with it. She said, yeah, the forgotten man is forgotten, and he was forgotten for a reason. Because, you know, there are a lot of really ugly politics, like, well, I'm the forgotten man. Well, yes, and I'm sorry, but we cannot organize a country around your racial anxieties or your particular class anxieties. You know, in the book, I quoted from a really interesting study called Dying of Whiteness by a doctor named Jonathan Metzl. I don't know how you deal with the anxiety, you know, and this is the kind of challenge I would throw back to, and I actually said this on Twitter, that I would throw back to people like David Brooks, to say, when you've got a guy who says, my liver is failing, and if I have to get another liver through Obamacare, I'd rather die. Because that, at least that way, some welfare queen getting my taxes, this is from a guy who never paid taxes in his life, of course, then that way, if that's what it takes to stand by my identity as, you know, an empowered man, you know, pride in my region, well, then I think at that point you kind of say, I don't know how to answer you. And the other David at the Atlantic, David Frum, I think has a good response to this, to say at some point we have to understand the limits of paternalism and accept that our fellow citizens have agency and we cannot stop them from hurting themselves. So I think that there's truth in this, and I think, again, it goes back to what I said about cultures being too close together. You know, the idea that people in Mississippi, you know, are spending all this time thinking about what people in San Francisco do is astonishing to me. You know, those people in Chicago or Los Angeles or Boston, they really look down on us. My answer has always been, who cares what they think? But the internet has closed that space and driven us together to the point where we hear those voices, and both of them recoil from it. Because as I have a very good friend that I debate this with all the time on the internet who's from Mississippi and lives here in Los Angeles now. And he says, you have to, and I said, why is it always incumbent upon the people in the cities to say, we understand you and we're sorry, and we know you? Because I always say, why is it incumbent upon me to be the object of your hatred? I have a life too. I'm an American citizen. And so I think Brooks kind of fell for that narrative that the paternalistic, enlightened people need to understand the poor, benighted, you know, and I'm uncomfortable with that. I think in the old school conservative movement, we used to say personal responsibility, take charge of yourself. You'd rather die than get a new liver? Then I'm sorry to hear that, but I'm going to stop arguing with you, and somebody else needs that liver. And I think, you know, tough love is the right answer to that, but that's a really hard thing to suggest to your fellow citizens.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Adarsh, sophomore at CMC. We've met before. Thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. So you talked about how one of the causes of rising illiberalism is, you know, well-to-do middle-class people just being bored and getting behind crazy populist causes. But I'm interested in how you would reconcile that with also decreasing voter turnout and a general disillusionment with politics, right? How can people simultaneously be disillusioned with politics or not want to participate in the system and then get bored and run behind populist causes?
You know, I really rebel against the non-voter. I really have no patience for them. They say, well, I don't have time for this, and nothing represents me, and I don't care. Well, you've got plenty of time to stare at YouTube for 3 hours. You know, for somebody who's so pressed for time that you couldn't figure out when the local primary was or what questions are on the ballot, you sure know the ins and outs of every single Facebook meme that you've been clogging my email with forward with. I think it is again, I think it's okay to call people out for that, to say, no, I'm sorry, if you didn't vote, I've said to friends who, so I didn't vote, and I said, well, then I don't care what you think. Thank you. You amplified the effect of my vote. And they get, you know, people get pretty touchy about that. But if you don't vote, then I don't know what to say to you. You know, we were talking earlier at the table about turnouts in primaries. I'm sorry, when you claim that there is no choice, I don't get any choice at the national level. Well, when the turnouts in party primaries on both sides are 12, 13, 14%, you have created the problem where there's no choice. You've delegated, I think you and I were talking about this a minute ago. You've delegated the choice of candidates to the most extreme and motivated people in your party because they were the only ones who showed up for the primary. And then you said, well, none of these choices are all too terrible and too crazy. As I always put it in these talks with my friends, who keeps choosing these people, ask the voters. You did. And you did it either by positively doing this as part of a fringe or simply by not showing up. So in a country where I think 2020 was a dangerously, I know we always say, oh, the most important election of our lives. And in the book, I say we need to stop talking that way. But I think 2020 was now, as we see in hindsight from what's being revealed through all these things with the 1-6 Commission and so on, this was one of the most dangerous elections in U.S. history. And we patted ourselves on the back for getting to 66% turnout and 50% of the youth turnout of people under 30. That's abysmal. That's embarrassing. For the greatest democracy in the world, the longest continuously functioning written constitution on planet Earth, that is a humiliation, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. And I'm hectoring everyone, so I'll stop. I'm sorry. But I'm the people who say, well, I just don't vote because I don't feel I have a voice or a choice, well, then it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I missed an election since I was 18, and I've usually been on the losing end of most of them.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi, Professor. My name is Josh Morgenstein, first year here, IR major. Let me just say thank you so much for your talk. I really found myself agreeing to a lot of the reasons that you provided as to why democracy is in decline. I guess one area where I sort of want to challenge you on is the role that globalization and economics are playing in it, and I'll just provide like 3 brief examples. First being that one of the reasons Trump won in 2016 is because he was able to break the blue wall, and many, I guess, former factory workers in Pennsylvania and Ohio, and places like that, I think felt disillusioned by, outsourcing of jobs, for example. Second being that, the Lega Party and the Five-Star Movement in Italy are increasingly appealing to, poor Italians in the southern part of Italy. And then the third being, the continuing popularity, I guess, of left-wing populism in Latin America from, AMLO to Evo Morales. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and I also wanted to get your thoughts on how you think technological advancements such as automation will either, I guess, exacerbate this problem that you're talking about, or whether it could actually provide the cure.
All right, let me try and take, that's a lot of points, so if I forget any of them, remind me, but I'm gonna try and take them backwards. First of all, I think you're empirically wrong about a few of those. One of the points I make in the book is actually Fukuyama made this point. He said, we would have expected to see, if these conditions are the things that are driving this illiberalism, we would have expected to see the rise of left-wing social movements. And we haven't. In fact, these illiberal movements on the rise around the world are right-wing movements, nationalist and populist. And they're almost overwhelmingly middle-class movements, and not the poor. So now you can say in Latin America there are left-wing social movements, as there have always been. But this wave of illiberalism is not being driven, and Fukuyama actually points it out. He says this is a counterintuitive outcome. He said it should have been left-wing movements if globalization, he said globalization was kind of an aggravating factor that triggers some of this. He says, but then it doesn't produce left-wing movements. What we have are actually right-wing movements. In Italy, with the Five-Star Movement, I think it is misdirection to say, well, there are people in southern Italy who are, moving toward that, but that's always been the case in Italy. The southern Italian parties are always like that, and that, in fact, the Five-Star Movement, gets into bed with the Lega, right, the northern parties, and the whole thing just falls apart because, in fact, there is no program. It just comes apart, and now I think we're kind of reverting to the mean of the northern parties are like, I remember I was there before all this stuff started, and a friend of mine in Milan, we were got a think tank in Milan, he said, we could run all of Italy and never tax anybody in the south because it doesn't matter anyway. That to me, that's probably where they're going back to. But Five-Star was astroturfed. It was wealthy guys propping up a comedian to create a social movement that was You know, in some sense, some of these populist movements, you really have to be middle class to be informed and educated enough to kind of get the joke. And so I think, you know, on that one, the Italian thing, we can disagree. I think that's just reversion to the mean. And the first one, your point about Trump kind of speaking to those people, again, the Trump voters were not poor. That was an initial kind of knee-jerk analysis that happened in 2016. So, well, this is just poor people voting for Trump. And of course, in Appalachia, yes, it's true, people voted for Trump. But West Virginia has been voting solidly red since 2000, for 20 years. You know, Donald Trump or anybody with an R after his name was going to carry West Virginia. What was really striking about Trump was how many of the people who voted for him were actually pretty well off, middle class, middle-aged, white, and male. And the big predictor for Trump voters was not poverty, it was education. And the education gap revealed itself in things like, if you, the income didn't matter. If you were a guy who owned a pizza joint who made $200,000 a year and you only had a high school degree, you voted for Trump because you felt culturally disrespected. The thing about the China shock, and I actually took a run at this in the book, and I hate this argument because the China shock people keep backing up and redoing their numbers. The authors of the China shock paper that came out years ago that was so influential in 2013 have now issued a revision saying, well, we weren't as right as we thought, but we were pretty right. But the fact of the matter is, you know, and I kind of autobiographically tell this story. A lot of those factories that people think the Chinese emptied out were empty 35 years ago. You know, well, we're upset about our jobs going to China. Your jobs didn't go to China. Those factories, this is an actual story from the book, a friend of mine in my hometown, it's all factories. I mean, I grew up with smokestacks outside of my house. You know, my hometown, you say Massachusetts and people think of little Village Greens and Concord and Lexington. My hometown looked like Pittsburgh. And my buddy points out the window of his diner and he says, I remember when those factories were full. And I said, that is literally impossible. We broke the windows in those factories as young juvenile delinquents, and we were. You know, so, and my brother was a cop, which made things really itchy. I said, we broke the windows in that place when we were kids in the early 70s. It was empty then. And he shook, I remember he kind of shook his head like there were bees. Like it was like, that can't, you know, like just, it can't be true. And so I mean, I just think that the empirical basis of all three of those points are just wrong. There are places that, yes, there's no doubt that, you know, bring China into the WTO, move some manufacturing out of the United States. But the other, and this is where I get back, here, let me back up to the title of the book. Part of the reason we offshored a lot of manufacturing is because we are a country that has an average of 3 televisions in every house, and we wanted that. And we made a conscious decision that consumerism was good. I'm getting perilously close to Gordon Gekko here, you know, TVs, for want of a better word, are good. And we didn't want to pay what it would cost to have Americans make those televisions. And so we said, let's do this globalization thing because it means cheap cars, air conditioners, TVs, and I don't want to think about who's making them. And I don't want you to bother me with the costs of this down the line. Now, the other thing, and I'll say one other thing about factory work, because Trump did, I'm going to reopen these factories. The people who are nostalgic for factory work, to me, are people that have never set foot in a factory. I grew up around them. I knew people who worked in them. I walked through a lot of them. If that's your idea of making America great again, then have at it. Because there was a reason that we got rid of those factories. My first job in politics as a young intern at 19 years old, and I was telling some of my seatmates about this and some folks earlier, I was on a plant closing task force. We lost the biggest employer in my hometown, 4,000 jobs in a city of 55,000 people. Why? Because they made old single-ply tires during the collapse of the auto industry in a 100-year-old factory in the Frost Belt. And it's, but how can we lose these jobs? Well, because nobody wants American cars and nobody wants your tires. And you know, that happened in 1980. The Chinese didn't do it. And so I think one of the things Trump successfully did was to hijack this narrative like the Jedi mind trick and say, remember when the Chinese took all the tires out of Massachusetts? Yes, I remember that. It was terrible. And it just, there's no arguing with it now. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to kind of go point by point and kind of, you know, knock down these points.
No, it's okay.
Automation, your point about automation is important because we are becoming more productive but requiring fewer jobs. My question to that is, so what do you want to do? You know, like, do you want to pay more for stuff and just the first, you know, you're ready to ask a question. The first globalization issue that ever happened in my hometown happened in the early 1970s. My hometown was the home of Spalding, the sports manufacturer. It was the only like cool industry in my hometown, and I had a really elite job at Spalding. I was the janitor for a while, and there was this huge ruckus when, I sounded so old saying that was a breakfast club. I heard a ruckus. But there was this huge ruckus in my hometown when they moved the production of baseballs from Chicopee to Haiti. And this was like 1974, and the guy said, I'm sorry, I can't pay Americans to hand sew baseballs. They won't do it. It would cost me a fortune, and you won't buy them. So I'm doing it in Haiti. What do you want me to do? And people were like, I want you to make American baseballs and make it just, you know, magic, make it happen. And Spalding went, we're going to make baseballs in Haiti. Because, you know, and unless you want Little League guys to have to pay $30 a baseball, that's what we've got to do. And I think that that's the automation problem. It's like, okay, yes, automation is going to tear the heart out of a lot of American jobs, and people will have to get jobs doing something else. The question is, what would you have them do? And I think when Trump promised people factory jobs, he was just being cruel. He had no idea what he was talking about. And he said, I'll get these factories open. The whole point should not be to reopen factories. Shouldn't be to reopen coal mines. I'm sorry, I was in Indiana last week, 2 weeks ago. It's a very touchy subject, but I don't think you should want your children to follow you into the coal mining business. The whole point of being an advanced country is that your children shouldn't have to go down into coal mines anymore. And Trump said, I'm going to say your children will mine. Imagine the country we become when a winning argument is your children will mine coal and their children's children will mine coal. Well, who the hell's running for office? Brezhnev? What does that mean? But it just sounded good. It was like the world won't change too fast. And I think it also means my children won't leave me. I think that's a huge amount of this anxiety about the forgotten towns. It's not that people want their kids to mine coal or work in factories. They don't want them to leave. And I'll add one more autobiographical detail. Maybe I'm different about this because I came from a factory town, and like Fiona Hill, whose book just came out when her mother said, that's the title of the book, she said, there's nothing for you here. My mother said to me, leave. She said, it's a good town, we raised you, did our best, now go somewhere else. And that's what I did. And so maybe I'm a little hard-hearted about this. I don't have that sense of place that some conservatives talk about. I just think there comes a time to move.
Well,
Sorry,
thank you
that
so
was
much,
a really
Professor.
long answer to that
Yeah, no, I
question.
really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, good evening, Professor Nichols. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Omer Lakhani. I'm a freshman here at CMC. I just wanted to touch on the fact that you included India in your list of examples, and you talked about how some of the founding principles of liberal democracy are equality, tolerance, secular government. But I would argue that India never had those to begin with. You know, with their founding, they were, they looked down on their Muslim citizens and in fact regarded them as less. So my question is, with a country like India, which is, arguably a democracy at best, what are your remedies for a country like that never really had those principles to begin with?
I would rather have an imperfect democracy struggling to be better than a strong man giving up and telling everyone to go backward. I mean, you could argue the same thing about the United States after its founding, that we were not a democracy. We kept people in slavery. After the Civil War, we had two systems of justice, but that's why our Constitution says a more perfect union. And, history, this is one place where I really lose kind of my ability to reason with my friends on the progressive left because they want it all fixed tomorrow. I've lived long enough to see progress. The world is better than it was in 1970. It's better than it was in 1980. So the question is, was India a democracy before Modi? Yes. Not a perfect democracy. Not one that had realized all the promises of liberal democracy. But would I rather have lived in India than the Soviet Union? You bet. I mean, at least politically. Would I've rather, India has real elections. They have meaning. They matter. Now, this is becoming, Modi has sometimes been referred to as India's Putin. Whatever India's problems, I don't think that populist authoritarianism solves any of them. And I think that's just the recipe for more violence and more sectarian strife.
Thank you.
Please join me in thanking Professor Nichols for joining us this evening.